I never thought the woman who raised me would turn my own inheritance into a weapon aimed at my daughter's future. She thought she still controlled every door I walked through. She had no idea I'd already changed every lock in my life. "You'll sign this house over to your brother and you'll do it today, or you can forget you ever had a mother." My mother, Diane Foster, said those words standing in my own kitchen, holding a folder of legal paperwork like it was a winning hand. My brother stood behind her, arms crossed, wearing the smug expression he'd worn his entire life, the one that said he'd already won before the fight even started. My 6-year-old daughter, Maddie, was upstairs doing homework, completely unaware that the people downstairs were deciding whether she'd still have a bedroom by the end of the week. I looked at that folder. I looked at my mother's face, so certain, so practiced in getting exactly what she wanted from me. Then I smiled in a way that made her hand tighten slightly around the papers. "You should probably sit down for this," I said. "Before I get into it, take a second to like and subscribe if this story resonates with you, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to take you back to where all of this actually started, because you need to understand exactly what kind of household built the man standing in that kitchen refusing to fold. My name is Nathan Foster. I'm 38 years old, and for the first 18 years of my life, I was raised in a house where love was not something freely given. It was something earned, rationed, and constantly at risk of being revoked. My father died when I was 7. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, gone before the ambulance even made it to our street in Millbrook, Ohio. My mother never fully recovered from that loss, but rather than turning toward her children for comfort, she turned all of her remaining affection toward my younger brother, Kyle. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because he looked more like our father. Maybe because he was younger and easier to mold. Whatever the reason, from the moment I turned 8 years old, I understood my role in that household with painful clarity. I was the backup child. The insurance policy. The one who existed to make sure Kyle never had to struggle for anything. I remember birthdays that came and went without acknowledgement, while Kyle's birthdays involved cakes from the bakery downtown and presents wrapped in ribbon. I remember bringing home a report card with straight A's and watching my mother glance at it for exactly 3 seconds before setting it aside to ask Kyle how his baseball practice went. I remember scholarship applications I filled out alone at the kitchen table at midnight because nobody in that house thought my education was worth losing sleep over. By the time I turned 18, I'd learned the lesson my mother had been teaching me my entire childhood. Nobody was coming to save me. I put myself through community college working night shifts at a warehouse outside Columbus, then transferred to Ohio State, where I finished a degree in mechanical engineering with a stack of student loans and exactly $40 in my checking account. I built a career from nothing. Small engineering firm, then a bigger one, then finally starting my own consulting practice that specialized in industrial automation systems. It took 12 years of 80-hour weeks, but by the time I turned 34, Foster Systems Consulting had a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies and a reputation that meant new business found me instead of the other way around. I met my wife, Rebecca, during my 2nd year of running the company. She was sharp, funny, entirely unimpressed by my growing bank account, which is exactly why I fell for her. We got married 18 months later, and Maddie came along the year after that. For the first time in my adult life, I had something my mother had never given me. A home where I mattered simply because I existed, not because of what I could provide. Rebecca passed away 3 years ago. Complications during a routine surgery that should never have gone wrong. I won't dwell on the details because that's not what this story is about, but I need you to understand that losing her hollowed me out in ways I'm still working through, even now. What kept me standing was Maddie. Every decision I've made since that day has been built around giving her the kind of childhood I never had. Stability. Consistency. A house that felt like a fortress instead of a courtroom where she had to argue for basic affection. My mother, meanwhile, continued exactly as she always had. Kyle never held a job for longer than 18 months. He bounced from failed business idea to failed business idea, always with some excuse, always with my mother right there to cover the gap. When Kyle's marriage fell apart 4 years ago, largely because he drained their joint savings account funding a cryptocurrency scheme that collapsed within 6 months, my mother didn't blink. She simply opened her own accounts wider. What I didn't fully understand until much later was exactly how deep that financial rescue operation went, and how it would eventually intersect with my own life in ways I never saw coming. 6 months ago, my grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, passed away at the age of 89. She was my father's mother, a woman who'd spent her final 15 years living quietly in a modest house outside Cincinnati, largely estranged from my mother due to disagreements that predated my own memory. I'd made a point of visiting her twice a year regardless of the family tension, driving down with Maddie for long weekends filled with garden walks and stories about my father as a boy. Those visits mattered to both of us in ways neither Kyle nor my mother ever understood, mostly because they never bothered to try. When Eleanor's will was read, it turned out she'd left the bulk of her estate, a modest but meaningful sum just over $400,000, along with her house, directly to me and to Maddie in a trust. Kyle received a small keepsake, a pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. Nothing more. My mother received nothing at all. I want to be honest with you. I didn't gloat about it. I didn't parade it in front of my family. I quietly used a portion of the inheritance to pay off the mortgage on my own home in Westerville, set aside a significant chunk into Maddie's college fund, and put the rest into renovating Eleanor's old house with the intention of eventually renting it out as additional income. I told my mother about the inheritance in a single phone call, factually, without embellishment, because I believed, foolishly it turns out, that honesty and transparency were still values worth practicing with her, even after everything. That phone call changed everything. 2 weeks after my mother learned about the inheritance, she started calling more frequently than she had in years. Not to ask about Maddie's school project or how I was managing the anniversary of Rebecca's passing. She called to ask pointed questions about the house, about the trust, about exactly how much money had landed in my accounts. I answered honestly each time, still not fully grasping what was building behind her questions. Then Kyle started calling too. Casual at first, catching up, asking about work, asking about Maddie. But within every conversation, there was always a pivot, always a mention of some new business opportunity he was excited about, always a subtle hint dropped about how nice it would be if family helped family the way Grandma Eleanor clearly believed in. I should have seen the pattern forming. I didn't, not fully, not until the afternoon my mother showed up at my house unannounced, Kyle trailing behind her, both of them dressed like they were walking into a business meeting rather than a family visit. That was the day the folder appeared on my kitchen counter, and the day I finally understood exactly what my mother had been planning since the moment she learned about Eleanor's will. Let me walk you through what happened that afternoon in detail, because every piece of it matters. It was a Thursday in early October. Maddie had come home from school an hour earlier and was upstairs finishing a reading assignment about the water cycle, her voice occasionally drifting down through the floorboards as she practiced reading the vocabulary words out loud to herself. I was in the kitchen prepping dinner when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my mother standing on the porch in a tailored blazer she typically reserved for church functions and formal occasions, Kyle standing slightly behind her shoulder in a button-down shirt that looked freshly pressed. Neither of them had called ahead. Neither of them offered a greeting beyond a clipped hello before my mother pushed past me into the entryway, already talking. "We need to discuss something important," she said, walking straight through to the kitchen like she still owned the deed to every room I'd ever lived in. Kyle followed, offering me an awkward half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. I closed the front door and followed them into the kitchen, where my mother had already set a manila folder down on the counter beside the cutting board I'd been using. She opened it with a practiced flourish, sliding a stack of papers toward me. "Your grandmother's will was unfair," she said, her voice already carrying the edge of an argument she'd clearly rehearsed. "Eleanor was never in her right mind those last few years, and everyone knows it. She should have split that inheritance evenly between you and your brother. It's only right that we correct that now." I looked down at the papers. It took me a moment to fully process what I was reading. It was a property transfer document professionally drafted transferring ownership of Eleanor's house, the one I'd already begun renovating, entirely into Kyle's name. Below that sat a second document, a request for me to liquidate a portion of the trust fund I'd set up for Maddie and redirect those funds into a joint account controlled by Kyle and my mother. "You'll sign this house over to your brother and you'll do it today," my mother said, her tone flattening into something cold and absolute, "or you can forget you ever had a mother." I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of what she'd just said settle fully into my chest. Kyle stood behind her, arms crossed, wearing an expression I recognized instantly from childhood, the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided in his favor. I thought about every birthday that passed without acknowledgement. Every report card ignored. Every night I sat alone at that kitchen table filling out scholarship applications while Kyle got driven to baseball practice in a car my mother had co-signed for. I thought about Rebecca, about the promise I'd made to myself the day Maddie was born that she would never once wonder whether she mattered in this family. I picked up the papers, scanned them one more time, then set them back down on the counter with deliberate calm. "You should probably sit down for this," I said. My mother's expression flickered, uncertainty briefly crossing her face before she recovered her composure. "Excuse me." "Sit down," I repeated. "Both of you. Because I think it's time we finally have an honest conversation about this family." Kyle shifted his weight, glancing toward my mother like he was waiting for permission to react. My mother remained standing, arms crossed now to match her son's posture, chin lifted in the same defiant angle she'd used on me 1,000 times throughout my childhood. "There's nothing to discuss," she said. "This is what's fair. This is what family does for each other." "Family," I repeated slowly. "Let's actually talk about that word for a minute because I don't think we've ever agreed on what it means. If you've ever had to draw a hard line with a parent who saw you as an obligation instead of a son, hit that like button right now and let me know in the comments how you found the strength to finally say no." I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down myself, resting my forearms on the table, keeping my voice level even as everything inside me sharpened into focus. "Do you remember my 9th birthday, Mom?" She blinked, caught off guard by the shift. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Humor me," I said. "Do you remember it?" She hesitated, clearly searching for an answer that wouldn't incriminate her. "I don't remember every single birthday, Nathan. That was 30 years ago." "I remember it," I said. "I remember it because you forgot it entirely. You took Kyle to buy new cleats that afternoon because his baseball season was starting the following week. I sat at the kitchen table by myself and ate a bowl of cereal because there was no cake, no candles, nothing. I didn't say anything because by that point I'd already learned that saying something never changed anything. My mother's jaw tightened. You're bringing up ancient history to avoid signing paperwork that's simply asking for fairness. No, I said. I'm bringing up history because you keep using the word fair like it's ever been something you cared about where I was concerned. You want to talk about fairness now, 30 years later, only because there's money involved. Kyle finally spoke, his voice defensive. That's not what this is about, Nathan. Mom's just trying to make sure the family stays balanced. I turned to look at my brother directly. Kyle, how many businesses has Mom bailaid you out of over the last 10 years? He shifted uncomfortably. That's not relevant. It's entirely relevant, I said. Because I did the math a while back, out of curiosity more than anything else. Between the restaurant that failed in 18 months, the crypto investment that wiped out your savings, and the 2 separate loans Mom co-signed for your car and your apartment deposit, I'm estimating she's put somewhere north of $200,000 into keeping you afloat over the last decade. Meanwhile, I put myself through college on loans I paid off myself, built a business from nothing, and never once asked either of you for a dollar. My mother's face had gone rigid. That money isn't relevant to this conversation. It's entirely relevant, I said, because you're standing in my kitchen demanding I hand over property and money my own grandmother specifically left to me and my daughter, under the argument that family is supposed to share equally. But sharing was never something you believed in when it came to me. It only became a principle worth enforcing the moment I had something you and Kyle wanted. The room went quiet for a moment. I could hear Maddie's voice faintly upstairs, still practicing her vocabulary words, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening below her. My mother's composure cracked slightly, just enough for something colder to surface underneath it. Your grandmother was manipulated. Eleanor never liked me, and she used that will to punish me through you and your brother. Grandma Eleanor left me and Maddie that inheritance because she watched me show up for her year after year when nobody else in this family bothered, I said. She watched me bring my daughter down to visit twice a year, every year, without fail. She watched me sit with her during chemo when Kyle couldn't be bothered to send a card. That wasn't manipulation, Mom. It was her looking clearly at which grandchild actually cared. Kyle's face flushed. I was busy, Nathan. I had things going on. You always had things going on, I said. That's been the excuse for 30 years. Meanwhile, I built an entire life around actually showing up for people, because nobody ever showed up for me. My mother slammed her palm flat against the counter, the sound sharp enough that I heard Maddie's footsteps pause upstairs. I am your mother. You owe me respect regardless of how you feel about the past. I owe you nothing, I said, and I said it calmly without raising my voice, because I'd waited 30 years to say those exact words and I wasn't going to waste the moment by shouting them. Respect is earned, not owed by default because of biology. You taught me that lesson yourself every single time you chose Kyle over me. I'm simply applying the lesson back. I stood up from the table, walked to the counter, and slid the folder of paperwork back toward my mother. I'm not signing anything. The house stays in my name. The trust stays exactly as Grandma Eleanor set it up, for me and for Maddie. And effective today, I think it's best if we take some real distance from each other, because I'm done being treated as a resource to be extracted whenever it's convenient. My mother stared at me, something between fury and disbelief settling into her expression. You're choosing money over your own family. No, I said. I'm choosing my daughter over people who have spent 30 years proving they only value me for what I can provide. That's not the same thing, and I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know it. Kyle stepped forward, his voice softening into something almost pleading. Nathan, come on, man. We're brothers. Doesn't that count for something? I looked at him for a long moment. It used to, I said. But brotherhood isn't a one-way street either, Kyle. I've watched you take and take for 30 years without ever once checking in on how I was doing after Rebecca died, without ever once asking about Maddie's life beyond a birthday text you probably set a reminder for. I don't hate you. I just don't think we actually know each other anymore, and I'm not interested in fixing that through a legal document that benefits you and costs me everything I've built. My mother picked up the folder, her hands trembling slightly, whether from anger or something else I couldn't fully tell. "You'll regret this," she said. "You'll regret cutting off your own family." "Maybe," I said. "But I'd regret it more if I taught my daughter that love is conditional, that it only shows up when there's something to gain. I already lived that lesson once. I'm not passing it down to her." They left shortly after that, my mother's heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, Kyle following a step behind, neither of them saying another word before the front door closed behind them. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after they left, listening to the quiet settle back into the house, listening to Maddie's footsteps eventually creak across the floor above me as she finished her homework. When she came downstairs 20 minutes later asking what was for dinner, I told her spaghetti, and I meant it when I smiled at her, because whatever storm had just passed through that kitchen, she remained completely untouched by it, exactly the way I'd promised myself she always would. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. My mother didn't call. Kyle sent one text message a few days later, something vague about hoping we could talk things through eventually, which I read and left unanswered, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what there was left to talk through. I used part of the trust, exactly as Alina had intended, to finish renovating her house. I hired a property manager, listed it as a long-term rental, and within a month had a reliable tenant, a young family relocating to Cincinnati for a hospital residency. The rental income went directly into a separate account earmarked for Maddie's future, exactly where Alina had wanted it to go. I also did something I probably should have done years earlier. I found a therapist, a calm, steady woman named Dr. Patricia Renner, who specialized in family estrangement and grief. Over the following months, I worked through layers of resentment and guilt I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself, the complicated tangle of loving a mother who'd never quite loved me back the way I needed, and finally giving myself permission to stop chasing that approval. About 4 months after that afternoon in my kitchen, I received an unexpected call from my aunt, my father's younger sister, Carol, who lived out in Denver and had never been particularly close with my mother even before Alina's estrangement. She told me gently that Kyle's financial situation had collapsed even further. Apparently, without my mother's ability to keep bailing him out at the same scale, since a significant portion of her own savings had already been drained over the years, Kyle had defaulted on his apartment lease and moved back in with her temporarily. I felt something complicated hearing that news. Not satisfaction exactly, but not quite sympathy either. Mostly just a quiet confirmation that the patterns I'd spent my entire life observing in that family had simply continued along the trajectory they were always going to follow, regardless of whether I participated in funding them or not. 6 months after that afternoon, on a bright Saturday morning in April, Maddie and I drove down to visit Alina's grave, something we'd started doing quarterly since her passing. We brought flowers, sat by the headstone for a while, and Maddie told her great-grandmother in the earnest way only a 7-year-old can manage about the science fair project she just finished at school. On the drive home, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Dad, why doesn't Grandma Diane come visit anymore?" I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest without placing an unfair burden on a child who deserved simplicity in these things. "Sometimes," I said, "grown-ups need some space from each other to figure things out. It doesn't mean anyone stopped loving anyone. It just means some relationships need time to heal, Or sometimes they need boundaries so people can be healthier. She thought about that for a moment, staring out the window at the passing fields. Is that why you talk to Dr. Patricia sometimes? Something like that, I said, smiling slightly. Okay, she said simply and turned back to her book, completely satisfied with an answer that would have taken me years of therapy to fully understand myself. That's the thing about children. They don't need every complicated detail. They just need to know they're safe, that the adults around them are handling things, and that the ground beneath them isn't going to shift without warning. I've made it my life's mission to give Maddie exactly that kind of stability, the kind I spent my own childhood desperately searching for and never quite finding. A year has passed now since that afternoon in my kitchen. My mother and I have spoken exactly twice since then, both brief, cordial phone calls around major holidays, neither of us quite ready to fully bridge the distance between us, both of us, I think, still working through what an honest relationship might even look like after 30 years built on something else entirely. Kyle and I exchange occasional texts, nothing deep but at least something, a thread that hasn't been completely severed even if it's nowhere close to what brothers are supposed to have. I don't regret what happened that day. I don't regret refusing to sign those papers, refusing to hand over what Alina specifically intended for me and for Maddie. I think about my grandmother often, about the clarity she had in her final years, the way she saw exactly who showed up and who didn't and made her decisions accordingly, regardless of what anyone else thought was fair. Fairness, I've come to understand, isn't about splitting everything equally regardless of effort or history. It's about recognizing who actually did the work, who actually showed up, and honoring that truth even when it's uncomfortable for the people who didn't. Maddie is 7 now, thriving in second grade, still asking questions about science that leave me scrambling for answers, still completely unaware of just how close she came to losing the stability I'd spent her entire life building around her. I intend to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. Some evenings, after she's asleep, I sit in the living room of the house Rebecca and I bought together. The house that's fully paid off now thanks to a grandmother who saw clearly what my own mother never could. And I think about that folder on my kitchen counter, about the woman who thought 30 years of neglect could be erased with a single legal document. I think about the moment I said, "You should probably sit down for this." And I realize now that what I was really telling her was that the version of me who once needed her approval, who once organized his entire self-worth around finally being seen by his own mother, that version of me had quietly, permanently retired. What replaced him was someone steadier. Someone who understood that real family isn't measured by blood alone, but by who actually shows up, who actually sacrifices, who actually chooses you again and again without needing anything in return. I found that family in Rebecca, in Maddie, in a grandmother who saw me clearly when almost no one else did. And that, I've come to believe, is worth infinitely more than any house, any trust fund, any inheritance my mother ever wanted to redistribute in the name of fairness. Sometimes justice isn't decided in a courtroom. It's decided by the choices we make. This was Cold Verdict. Because every story has a verdict.